When Dave learns that his wife Deborah is cheating on him with Mike, a whirlwind of events ensues, changing the lives of all three. In this story, love, betrayal, and family ties collide, forcing the characters to confront the truth and their own beliefs about fidelity. Dave Brown sat in his living room. In a chair across from him was an empty couch. Between his chair and the couch was a coffee table with 3 glasses of champagne, 1 full, 2 empty. Next to the table was a bottle of the drink in an ice bucket. If anyone was watching him as he relaxed at 7:02 p.m., they would be a little concerned when he spoke clearly. "That's right, I can hear her car in the driveway," but there were no observers. Dave was alone in the room. He continued to sit with a relaxed look. When the front door opened, he couldn't be seen from where he was sitting, but he immediately heard his wife's voice. "Where are you, Dave?" "In the living room?" Deb entered the archway, holding the hand of a man about 5 years younger than her. At 49, he was thin, of medium height, and wearing a business suit. In her other hand, she held an orange A4 envelope. Dave, this is Michael." "Michael, this is my husband, Dave." Noticing that she averted her eyes and was generally nervous, Dave took 3 steps and warmly shook the uninvited guest's hand. "I'm very pleased to meet you, Michael. Do you mind if I call you Mike?" "Not at all, sir. May I offer you a glass of champagne?" "Please, have a seat." Dave watched as the 2 very embarrassed men sat down on the sofa and took the offered glasses. After he had filled them, he said, "Cheers. Now, would you mind telling this simple soul what's going on?" Deb and Mike looked over at each other. Mike nodded faintly and squeezed her hand. Dave, it's not really nice to talk about it, so I'll just tell you straight. Michael and I have fallen in love with each other. I'd like a divorce so we can get married." She paused, waiting for her husband's anger. She looked up from the floor to see the look on Dave's face. This was going to be awful, she just knew it. She hadn't expected his face to remain neutral. Unconsciously, she pulled herself a little closer to Mike. "Okay, Deb, are those the divorce papers?" Deb looked up, stunned again. She had rehearsed this scene in her head many times, but never, not even in her wildest dreams, had it been like this. She looked at Mike and tried to convey with a look, "I don't know what to say." He took the envelope from Deb and placed it on the table. "Yes, Dave, that's right. I think you'll find them very reasonable. Deb isn't asking you for anything but her car. In the package is her disclaimer of this house, your car, all of your joint assets, and your retirement fund. It's all signed and notarized on our end. I should warn you that I'm a lawyer, so it's okay, but feel free to hire your own representative to put your mind at ease." "Well, I must say, you're both very generous." Deb looked very flustered, like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. "It was Mike's idea, Dave. In fact, he insisted. He said it was bad enough that he was stealing his wife without taking your hard-earned assets. That was in no way my motivation, but Mike is pretty rich, even without your money. We'll have more than you and I ever had. Maybe things would have been different if you had gotten a job after the kids were older and helped with the finances, Deb." Deb lowered her eyes again. "So, Mike, is your wife going to give a speech like this, or has she already gotten it?" Mike replied, "No, my wife died 8 years ago. I'm a widower." "I'm sorry to hear that, actually." "Thanks, Dave. It hurt like hell for a year or so, but time heals all wounds, as they say. Look, I'm really sorry about this, but I met Deb and she was like the missing half of my soul. I didn't think I'd ever be whole again. I wanted to tell you that I've been in love with your wife for months." "It's okay, Mike. I never hold a grudge. Please, marry her with my blessing." Mike and Deb exchanged stunned looks. Deb, because it was not at all what she expected. Then she felt a huge sense of relief. A few months ago, she had led Michael to believe that her marriage to Dave had collapsed, that they were trying to save it, but there was little hope. She knew that the weak point in her plan was Dave's reaction, which might make Mike realize that wasn't quite true. That's why she begged Mike to do it without confrontation. Mike insisted that real men solved problems face to face. He didn't budge. Mike was stunned because even after Deb told him that her marriage was on its last legs, he expected a more angry reaction. From Deb's descriptions, he had formed a mental image of Dave, a large, uneducated man used to solving problems with his fists. Mike hesitated at the idea of taking a bodyguard with him tonight, but finally dismissed the thought. In the back of his mind, He thought that if the offended husband hit him a little, it might ease his own conscience. His own sense of propriety was weighing on him. "So, Deb, I assumed you met Mike at one of your girls' parties." Deb nodded at the coffee table. "One of the girls' parties that you assured me were completely harmless and didn't threaten our marriage when I asked." This time Deb nodded at the floor. "I guess that's a lesson for you, Mikey boy." Mike glanced at Deb. Deb's gaze moved to a section of the floor a little farther away from Mike. "So, what happens to people now? Come on, Deb, you've got to have a plan. You're giving me the house, so I assume you were going to pack up your stuff and move in with him. I won't get in your way. I was going to do it tomorrow while you're at work. They'll have the locks changed by tomorrow. I'm sure your lawyer friend will agree it's a wise move on my part. It's easier if you do it now, isn't it?" Deb and Mike got up to go upstairs. "How about we have a talk, Mike? Deb can start packing. Come on, Mike, let's have a chat. I think you owe me at least that much." Deb was torn between wanting to avoid this really uncomfortable situation and having to witness everything that was said. In the end, Mike made the decision for her, sitting back down. "Go on, Deb. I promise not to hurt him. I just want to have a chat. Until we're divorced, I'll feel responsible for your safety. I just want to make sure he's taking your best interests to heart. Besides, you made the decision to leave me. I don't see the point in trying to talk you out of it. Our marriage is obviously dead." Both men watched her walk up the stairs and disappear. "I have to say, you're being very sensible, Dave. It's all right, Mike. Between you and me, it's been about a year since I felt Deb's love. I guess that's when you two met. That will be a relief, indeed. I have no desire to condemn us both to a loveless marriage. Still, that's very nice of you, Dave. You're welcome, Mike. Now, as a lawyer, you know that whenever you sell a car or a house, you are legally obligated to point out any known defects to the new owners." Mike laughed. "Well, slavery is dead, and I don't think Deb would like being considered property that needs a transfer of ownership, but I know what you mean, Dave." Dave smiled too. He guessed correctly that Mike was a smart and decent man. "Okay, now please believe that what I'm about to tell you is not dictated by malice. I just want to point out some of Deb's flaws that may not be obvious after a year of knowing her. Besides, her future happiness is important to me. After all, I've been in love with her for 27 years. I'd also like to share everything I've tried to do to make her happy, but obviously failed. That way, you'll know not to waste your time doing the same thing." Mike nodded. He knew that what was about to happen probably wouldn't be entirely altruistic in its intent, but he felt compelled to listen to this innocent man. "Right. I assumed Deb was back on the pill." Mike nodded again, feeling a little awkward. It was tantamount to admitting that he'd slept with this guy's wife. "Yeah, she's on the pill. I had no idea she ever stopped. She was on the pill when we met, but about 6 to 12 months after we got married, she went off them. She said they suppressed her sexual appetite. It's been condoms for me ever since. I hate those damn things. They take away all the spontaneity. And I don't know about you, but I try my best to do without them." "Yeah, I know what you mean, Dave. Then when we decided to stop at 2 kids, she started using condoms as an excuse to not make love as often. I begged her to go back on the pill, but she refused, saying she didn't want to swallow artificial chemicals every day. Since then, our lovemaking has dwindled from several times a week to a few times a month, then to 0 about a year ago." Mike didn't answer. Anything he knew that Deb was very careful about what food she ate and opted for chemical-free options whenever possible. Sex with her was still exciting and happened at least 3 times a week, even with the restrictions on their encounters. "I know this is very ungentlemanly, Mike, but does she swallow your, well, you know?" Mike found this question very uncomfortable. People of his class didn't talk about such things. He involuntarily averted his eyes. "I understand. Yeah, I remember what she was like when Deb and I were dating. Now, please remember that I'm not saying all this with malice aforethought. If I was selling a car that I knew would have to throw a tire out 6 months after I got rid of it, I would have warned you about that too. Deb hasn't swallowed for me since we got married. In fact, I don't think I had until about 18 months after we were married, and the doggy style stopped shortly thereafter. We stopped having sex completely until recently. I just got tired of getting knockdowns and stopped asking. Maybe you'd like to write in your journal to keep track of any sudden downfalls every month or so." Dave paused so Mike could add something, but he didn't take the opportunity. "Here's another thing I didn't notice until a couple of years after we were married. I looked around one day and suddenly realized that almost everything I owned before Deb was gone. The bed, the clothes, the couch, and pictures of old girlfriends. Although, to be honest, I found them in the attic. I don't know if all women do this or if it's just Deb, but it was like she wanted to clear the nest of previous female influences." Again, Dave paused, and again, Mike was silent. He thought about his new bed and the sheets. Then he remembered his conversation with Deb a week ago about the portrait of his first wife, the woman he had loved tenderly until circumstances cut her out of his life. "I hope you're a better judge of her lies than I am, Mike. Just 3 weeks ago, I asked her if she still loved me and if we were good. She looked me straight in the eye and said yes. She did the same thing she always does, look me in the eye until I broke eye contact. I can't believe it only took 3 weeks to fall so much in love." Mike staggered slightly at the suddenness of this conversation and all the information Dave was trying to get him to internalize. Something about those last 2 sentences was disturbing, but he didn't have time to determine the source, so he focused on the only aspect he could absorb. "Don't worry, Dave, I'm a lawyer. I've spent 20 years learning how to recognize liars. They always give themselves away." "All right," chuckles again. "Just some advice that you may or may not take. Watch to see if she takes her rings off when she goes to visit her sister. You may want to check her underwear. I suggest you don't trust her blindly like I did. I thought she was completely incapable of deception, but I'm obviously a dumbass. What else can I say? Oh, yeah, if she's true to form, she'll probably stop going to the gym in about 6 to 12 months and gain a little weight." At this point, Dave stood up, grabbed a photo album off the shelf, and started flipping through the pages. Here are a couple of pictures from 2 years ago when she started going to bachelorette parties. As you can see, her face and ass are plump. But after 2 kids, who would be surprised by that? Mike turned a few pages and saw a chubbier version of his fiancée with far less makeup than he'd ever seen. He was a little stunned at the difference that a little makeup made. He continued flipping through the pages. "Is that Deb's mother I see? There's a strong resemblance. Yes, it is. Wait a minute." Dave picked up another album and opened it to a page. He waited for Mike to state the obvious. "Jesus, how old is she here?" "About 55. She was one of those women who, once they hit menopause around 52 or 53, lost their looks quickly. She took it very gracefully, though, simply saying that she thanked God for the outer beauty she had been blessed with for so long." Dave watched as Mike alternately looked at the 2 pictures. "Now, I promise to tell you about all my mistakes that caused her to fail to love me. I suggest you try a different approach. Mine was clearly unsuccessful." Dave paused to pour the champagne. "About 25 years ago, she wanted a wedding. I tried to object, saying we'd be better off investing in a house. But she said that if I had faith that we'd be together forever, I wouldn't save money for such an important day for her. If you want, I can find a copy of our wedding vows for you. From memory. We hold to the tradition, love, honor, obedience, and rejection of all others. If you try something different, you might do better than me. Not really important to you, but don't bother working your fingers to the bone and doing a bunch of overtime so she can get the flash house she's always wanted." It clearly wasn't holding her legs together. "In fact, we're probably here because I refused to pay for the facelift she wanted, preferring to invest in our retirement. She can be pretty persistent when her heart is set on something, you've probably noticed." Mike nodded, wondering if this characteristic of Deb's was really the wonderful quality he'd thought it was until now. "So, I thought in vain that I was being smart by asking her out every month to discuss anything about me or our relationship that was starting to irritate or cause the slightest resentment. Our last date was less than a month ago, and she didn't say anything. A man of your caliber, I'm sure you could come up with something better." At that moment, Mike noticed the light in Dave's eyes and suddenly realized what he was up to. Nevertheless, he made some good points. The idea that Deb was completely free of guile was very much at odds with some of his own thoughts lately. He was so taken aback by Dave's obvious amusement at the whole scenario that he ignored his internal alarm. Again, Dave kept talking, even though they were both obviously aware that Deb had stopped coming down the stairs, being within earshot. Keep an eye out for lists of things she's going to remove from the house. That's a good hint that she's already treating the marriage with contempt and is looking for a replacement. It won't change much of what happens, but it will allow you to prepare for the endgame she has planned and encourage you to start digging for other evidence. Mike blinked and looked around. For the first time, he saw 3 champagne glasses and a bucket of ice, clear evidence that all 3 people present knew about tonight's meeting in advance when it should have been just the 2 of them. His usually very observant nature missed the clues. Dave watched Mike's eyes run. Yeah, I knew it was going to be today. Deb called me twice today to make sure I'd be home by 7. Mike tore his gaze away from Dave and looked over to where Deb was halfway down the stairs. Deb resumed her descent, clearly pretending not to have heard the last few minutes of the conversation. Dave, do you want to talk about which of the family photos I can take now, or some other time? Dave ignored her and leaned across the couch from her, keeping his eyes on his rival. The last thing I did wrong was forgive Deb when I first caught her cheating on our marriage. What? Asked Mike. No, came out of Deborah's lips as she retreated into the kitchen. Yes, it was, right after our second child was born. I forgave her because she and our counselor convinced me it was an isolated mistake caused by postpartum depression. I often wondered if I had been too soft on her. Maybe a harder line at the time could have prevented a recurrence. I justified my action by saying that I was acting in the best interest of the children. They grew up to be good people, so hopefully, I did the right thing by them. For her sake, I hope you'll be generous enough to forgive her when your time comes. I don't know what to say, Dave. You don't have to say anything, Mike. Just answer me, look into your heart and ask yourself if you would forgive your late wife if you found her sleeping with someone in your own bed for the first time. Mike lost his composure. He leaned forward. Out of the corner of his eye, Dave noticed some movement and saw a pale-faced Deborah standing in the kitchen doorway. My wife would never disrespect me like that. We loved each other too. Wait a minute, you said the first time Deb cheated on me. Were there other times? No, just 2 times. Then and now. Deb jumped out of the kitchen. No, she screamed desperately. I'm done packing, Mike. If you take my suitcases, we can get out of here right now. Calm down, Deb. The last was said in a quiet but unrelenting voice. Surprisingly, the voice was Mike's. Deb stopped like a dumbfounded woman. Mike turned to Dave again. Deborah assured me that she wasn't cheating because you had an open marriage, Dave. Did she look you in the eye when she said that, Mike? Mike looked at Dave, then at a shrinking Deb, then back at Dave. Dave saw in Mike's eyes the sudden realization that he wasn't as good at recognizing liars as he thought he was. What did she tell you about the state of our marriage, Mike? She said it had been shaky for a few years, Dave. That you'd been seeing a counselor for a while but there was no hope for either of you. Dave didn't say anything back, just stared at Mike as he continued talking to fill the void. Now, I guess that doesn't really fit with what you said about still going on dates and asking if she loved you. Dave continued to look Mike in the eye. Again, he chose the exact moment when Mike realized he was being played like a complete fool. An expression easily interpreted as self-disgust flashed across the little man's face. Mike turned to the frozen Deborah. You goddamn. You've turned me into the man I despise the most, a man who has other men's wives without their husbands knowing. Upon hearing that statement, Deb dropped to her knees. Mike was suddenly speechless and interested in the same area of the carpet that had so fascinated Deb earlier. Finally, he pulled himself together and looked at Dave again. Please, Dave, you have to believe me. I had no idea. Don't worry, Mike. I told you she was a good liar. God, I wish she told me we had an open marriage, then I might have slept with her last year. The deliberate use of humor in a very tense situation seemed to work. Mike relaxed a little but remained silent. Does that mean the engagement is off? Yes, definitely. In that case, I want you to meet a couple of people, John, Alice. At that moment, the door to the basement opened. Hearing a noise, Mike turned around and saw a young man and woman approaching. Mike, I want you to meet my son, John, and my daughter, Alice. They were listening to our conversation through a microphone. John graduated from law school 2 years ago, and Alice earned her degree this year. John and Alice shook a confused Mike's hand. John then picked up an envelope from the table and began to nonchalantly examine its contents. Dave turned to his daughter. Do you believe me now, Alice? Yes, Dad. There's no doubt she's a cold, conniving schemer. All eyes turned to the moaning Deb, who was still on her knees but now her head was on the floor. Sensing the silence, she lifted her head and was met with 4 accusing stares. She jumped up and ran out the front door. No one made the slightest attempt to stop or follow her. John calmly finished going through the contents of the envelope. Everything seems to be in order, Dad. Good, thank you. Now, who wants a beer? I think I should go. You stay here, little Mikey. There's still some things we need to figure out. Like what? Well, I can forgive you for sleeping with that stupid girl like she's got an open marriage and all, but I have to decide whether to rip your head off and spit in your neck for trying to steal her. Mike looked at the other man, noting that the other man was a head taller and much larger than he. He looked into his eyes and saw a familiar glint. Dave decided to calm down a bit. John is doing what you do, Mike. By now Mike was no longer surprised that Dave knew so much about him. How's your current job, John? The hours are crap and the pay sucks. Don't you want to come and work with me? Hell yeah, Dave smiled. Then that leaves the issue of supporting my ex-wife until she gets a job. With a growing sense of relief, Mike entered the new topic. I'm really sorry, Dave. As soon as she lied to me, she broke the implied contract we had. In the event of a breach of contract, ownership passes to the previous title holder. Yeah, but morally, don't talk to me about morality. I'm a lawyer, John. Do you have a dictionary? I'm a little vague on what it actually means. Everyone laughed. No, seriously, Mike, I think you should look after her until she gets back on her feet. If you play your cards right, you can pretend you're thinking about keeping her and cheer yourself up in bed for a while. No, I can't do that. But I'll make sure she's okay. Not for her, for you. I admire craftsmanship wherever I see it, and tonight I was totally outclassed, wasn't I? Have you ever considered a career in law, Dave? The way you took me off balance, passing off negatives as positives and not giving me time to think was worthy of the best prosecutor I've ever seen. Dave smiled modestly but didn't say anything back. He loved his job and the people who surrounded him at work. So, 4 beers then? For the first time ever, Dave looked away until he was sure that the tears that had accumulated in the corners of his eyes were gone. He would not make eye contact again. By this time, Deborah Brown was already 700 meters away, walking fast and accelerating as if her heels were toast. This story captivates from the very beginning, immersing the reader in the tangled relationships of the 3 main characters. It vividly portrays the struggle with moral dilemmas and the complexities of family dynamics. Love, betrayal, and honesty are blended into a cocktail that prompts reflection on the value of sincerity in relationships. Story 2. Here we are again, sitting in the waiting room in front of the office of the marriage therapist my wife chose for us. We see her once a week, and this is our 12th visit. The therapist doesn't know it yet, but this is also our last visit. I have a surprise for both my wife and our therapist, and in the future, they can get together without me to figure out where they went wrong. My wife can pay. You've heard stories about therapists like this one, but I never thought I'd be dealing with one. I call her the charlatan. She's a husband-hating and it's no harder than it looks. She lives to make excuses for women and their bad behavior. My wife chose her despite my objections. Big surprise. We could have chosen a legitimate therapist together, talked with them, developed mutual trust in the one we chose, and moved forward to do the hard work together. But that didn't happen. Ruth needed to stack the deck so she could control the appointments. It's not that I object to therapy, I just don't think it's therapy. Every complaint my wife makes comes back to me with the words, David, what you need to realize is that you have not been providing for your wife well. At least that ends today, I suppose. It's worth doing a little review of what brought us to this point. We got married right out of college 25 years ago. We have 2 children, a boy and a girl, and both are in college. They're great kids, but don't ask me how. I tried to be the best father I could be, but my wife went missing so often that my own children jokingly called me, pal, in the papa-mom sense. When I tried to fill the void, the first time they did this, I took offense, but quickly realized that they could see that I was both mother and father to them. I made their school lunches, helped with homework, took them to little leagues and soccer games, met with their teachers, and heck, more often than not, cooked dinner and did the dishes. My wife's contribution seemed to consist of complaining about how important her low-paying job was, complaining about me, and being too tired to do anything. That's not entirely fair. She did contribute, but over the years, she seemed to be less and less involved with the family and more preoccupied with life outside the home. Complaints about work were replaced by complaints about me. I never did enough, or I didn't do it right, or we didn't have enough money, or we didn't take the best vacations, or whatever else. Her frustration made her focus on the kids. I saw this, and as they got older, I started hearing it a lot. "Daddy, you're the best," and it made it all worth it. You know the old, "How do you boil a frog?" story? I was that frog. Anyway, that frog finally got fed up, and I jumped out of the pot. I spent most of my adult life trying to figure out what was wrong with my wife. She grew up in a dysfunctional family. You could read about it in horror stories if horror stories were about parents who stalked their children. Her mother was a serial adulterer who used her daughter to cover up her infidelities. As a child, she was taught never to tell her father what really happened during these shopping trips. Her father wasn't stupid, but he was weak and, as you can imagine, broken. He was a mouse that growled, so painfully shy he could barely hold a conversation. He'd stop by for a drink after work, and when he got home, he'd raise hell. The house became a battleground where there was no real communication, no time together, no joy. As a child, my wife would see evening approaching, gather something to eat, and stay in her bedroom to avoid hostilities in the rest of the house. Is it any wonder she became the way she did? Deception and manipulation were her lot, and it took me decades to realize that she was deeply broken and could never truly live in a marriage. That realization softened the pain, and my love for my children kept me going until they were grown. I did see a therapist for a while. I explained to her the picture I had seen, told her about Ruth's childhood, and kept asking what I could do to fix the slow destruction of my marriage. She patiently explained to me that she could only help whoever was in front of her, and that was me. She taught me to take care of myself, to stand up for myself, and not be dragged down into the pit of an empty life that Ruth's existence had become. I learned to focus on my children, to live for them, and to keep the door open in case Ruth ever decided to enter the family. Now that the children were in college, I realized that the end was near. I couldn't go on like this, and I was almost certain that Ruth would destroy our marriage very soon. You see, my own therapist explained to me that when a child grows up in chaos, they adapt to it. I know it sounds crazy, but she said that when things were good in her life, Ruth would blow things up because chaos was what she was most comfortable with. That was a revelation. I thought I'm not crazy after all. I saw the pattern, but I didn't believe it. Now that the kids were off to college, our finances were under control, and the house was almost paid off. The two of us had enough free time to enjoy time together. She was destined to ruin everything. My musings were interrupted when the door to the inner office opened, and another couple entered the waiting room. The husband looked tearful, and the wife looked smug. The quack had earned her paycheck for this session. By then, I knew how to proceed. We would wait for the charlatan to write her notes on the last session, and then the door would open. "Ruth, I'm ready to meet with you and David," it was her way of saying, "I've washed away the blood, so bring in the next victim." Ruth settled herself on the couch, and the charlatan always expected me to sit next to her. But this time, I chose the chair to Ruth's right, with my back to the door. "David, please sit with your wife. I'm sorry, but I can see her better from here. Besides, my back hurts, and this couch has never been comfortable for me." God, that was an understatement. The charlatan looked annoyed and said, "David, is there anything you want to say after our last meeting?" "Yes, I do. We keep coming here, supposedly working on our marriage, but I still can't get over the idea that my wife is cheating on me. I can't get over it, and nothing that has been said here will change my mind." The charlatan didn't even wait for my wife to speak. "David, I've already told you that I'm absolutely certain that Ruth is not cheating on you. She and I have talked, and I'm convinced it's all just in your mind. You need to drop it and move on." She didn't even wait for my answer. "Ruth, what do you want to talk about today?" She didn't hide her bias, did she? Ruth went through a mental list of my shortcomings and stopped at, "He doesn't support me." That was all it took, and she was off to the races. "He complains when I work late, and I just want to go out with my friends sometimes to unwind, and blah, blah, blah." Ruth was complaining, and the charlatan was nodding her head. It was just like every session. I knew Ruth would go on for a long time, so I let my thoughts wander. Early on in our therapy, in one of our one-on-one sessions before I even realized our therapist had an agenda, I told her that I thought my wife had been unfaithful in the past. I had no proof, it was just a feeling. The quack shut me down, dismissed the very thought of it, and told me it was all in my head. 2 months later, my doubts turned into certainties, and her opinion went down the drain as I began to prepare for war. The preparations took some time, but, David, are you listening? Oh, yeah, I heard. I don't support her, Ruth said. You ignore her and her needs. You don't support her when she needs to work late, and you're jealous when she wants to spend a few hours with her friends. Well, I keep coming back to the feeling I have that she is not faithful to the marriage. Now the charlatan couldn't even hide her contempt. David, get over it and be a man. I told you she's not cheating on you. Your wife needs a man who can take care of himself. But if you keep acting like this, maybe she should find someone else. The charlatan only shook her head in disgust. Ruth, you said he doesn't take care of the house like he used to. He doesn't mow the lawn when he's supposed to. The house needs a new coat of paint, and blah, blah, blah. I thought, I can name this tune from 3 notes. I guess I gave away my thoughts, that was careless of me. David, what are you grinning about? This is serious work we're trying to do. I'm sorry, and with that most insincere of apologies, my thoughts began to wander again as my wife spoke. Ruth always insists on driving her car to our meetings with the charlatan. I'm at work, but I could easily pick her up, and we'd drive together. No, that's not going to work. Also, for some reason, she's never free in the afternoon after our meetings. I procrastinated, I admit it, but eventually, I pulled the string. I hired a private investigator to follow her starting the afternoon after our meetings. And as it turned out, after each session, she was meeting Bill Peterson at the Best Western Hotel off the highway. I expanded the coverage, and now it was happening every Thursday. But only on Thursday. Why weren't they running off every chance they got? It soon became obvious that this was not a new affair, and it had been going on for some time. That's when it hit me that she was keeping him at a distance. Even with her adulterous boyfriend, she couldn't risk letting him get too close. She was deeply broken. They had a permanent room, which made it easy for my private investigator to sneak a camera and record her into the room. After seeing this, therapy became just a waiting game for me to get all my ducks in a row. I now had 3 opponents to crush: my wife, Bill, and the charlatan. When I was ready, I visited Bill's wife and gave her copies of all the documents. She utilized the services of my attorney. She was not a very healthy woman, which caused me some apprehension, but the lawyer assured me that even with her long-standing physical problems, she would be able to get him out. That sounded like the revenge I was looking for. David, are you listening? Huh? Oh, yeah, I heard. The house needs a new paint job. Well, that's when there was a knock on the door. Who the hell is it? The charlatan stood up. I'll get it. Anyway, it's for me, your place, David. It's a seance. This is sacred time. What do you mean? Arranging something outside of. I didn't give her time to finish. I opened the door, and there stood Bill and his beautiful, albeit frail wife, Marie. Welcome. Perfect timing. I'm glad you could make it. Come on in. Bill looked confused. Marie looked like a determined woman. Her hands shook with neurological weakness as she placed her cane on each step, but she strode purposefully into the room. Bill clearly didn't know who I was. He held out his hand. My wife made this appointment. I honestly don't know why we're here, he said. Well, let me explain, Bill. Turning to my right and pointing to my wife sitting on the couch, I said, You know my wife Ruth, don't you, Bill? I've heard of her, but I've never seen her. The color disappeared from his face, and he turned pale white. I don't lie, Bill. We're all friends here. Therapy sessions are a safe place. I stole that phrase from my first session with the quack. Coincidentally, that's when she decided to speak up. David, what is going on here? How can you interrupt a session like that? I'm sorry, Miss Jacobs. This is Bill Peterson. He's been having an affair with my wife for almost a year, and before you say it's all my imagination, I have numerous pictures and videos of the two of them sleeping together at the Best Western. Turning to Bill, I said, Bill, why don't you sit next to Ruth? If you can sleep with her, at least you can sit next to her while we deal with this unpleasant matter. Then turning to Marie, I kissed her on the cheek and said, "Marie, it's always good to see you. Would you like this chair? It's surprisingly comfortable." Smiling, she sat down and stared at her husband. I sat down in the chair across from her so that the coffee table was between us, Ruth and Bill on my right, and the charlatan on my left, still making guppy fish faces. Her mouth opened and closed but made no sound. "Well, isn't this wonderful, Marie? You look beautiful as always. How are you feeling today?" "Better than usual, David, thanks for asking. I think I'm about to have a weight lifted off my shoulders." I smiled at that remark. Marie was a woman with real problems and a difficult future. Her optimism and cheerfulness were inspiring, so Miss Jacobs had told me earlier that all my thoughts about Ruth cheating on me were all in my head. Marie laughed. I looked around the room. "Who wants to see the pictures?" I grabbed my tablet. "If anyone wants to watch one of the movies." Looking at Charlatan, I said, "What about you? Do you want to watch that pleasuring my wife in a novel you told me didn't exist?" No one spoke. Turning to Bill, I said, "You know, Bill, having my wife is one thing, but I've been her husband for a long time, and despite her lies and betrayal, I still have a sense of responsibility for her." "You have a tendency to her, Bill. You've never just made love to her. Or maybe that's not what she's into right now." I looked at Ruth. "Maybe if I'd known you wanted to be treated like that, you wouldn't have slept with that slippery coward behind my back." I never would have thought it, but she was really sobbing. To me, it was incomprehensible. Obviously, she knew our marriage was over. Bill's marriage was over. Now she could have Bill all she wanted, and any other man she wanted. Why the tears, then? All she was losing was me, and she made it clear that she didn't need me in the first place, except perhaps to provide the emotional stability she couldn't provide for herself. Ruth finally found her voice. "I never meant for you to find out. I'm sorry, David. I never meant to hurt you," and so on, moving down the list of cheating cliches. It was so pathetic, it was almost funny. "Stop pouring water, Ruth. You've had a year to think about your actions." Looking at the pathetic semblance of a man sitting next to her, I asked, "What's your excuse?" "Your wife gave you 2 children who are now grown and living on their own. She has special needs, and you repay her by sneaking around. Have you ever thought about being a man, fulfilling your responsibilities, and being honest with someone for once in your life?" I could see the anger rising on his face, and I was more than willing to do so if I had the chance, but I didn't. The two of them ended up sitting like that, offering worthless excuses and empty apologies, until there was another knock on the door. Oh, I looked at Marie. It looked like our last guest had arrived. Up to this point, the charlatan had been surprisingly silent. This caused her a second explosion of indignation, to which I simply shrugged and opened the door. A middle-aged man in a cheap suit entered the office, and I pointed him to the couch. "That's them." He walked over to the 2 crooks, handed them each an envelope, and said, "Ruth Harper, Bill Peterson, you have been served." Then he took a picture and turned away. That was the end of it. I guess it was the first time he had ever served someone in a marriage counselor's office because as he walked by, he gave me a sly smile and quietly left the room. I closed the door behind him and returned to my seat. It's been quite a day, hasn't it? I could tell by the clock on the wall that our hour was running out. Perhaps Miss Jacobs could spend the last few minutes with the cheaters to help them figure out what happened here today. I turned to her and added with a fair amount of sarcasm in my voice, "And maybe you can figure out how you could have gotten everything so horribly mixed up." I stood up, helped Marie to her feet, and took her hand as we left the office. Walking slowly down the hall, I asked, "Are you going to be okay?" "I think so. When you first showed me the evidence of their betrayal, I was confused. I thought, how could the man I married do this to me? Now I know he's not the man I married, and he's not the man I thought I married. All I'm losing are memories or the illusion of what I thought I had, but didn't." I felt like she was speaking for both of us. She looked at me. "I still have children, and in a few years, there will be grandchildren. I'll be fine. You also have friends, don't forget that. And maybe in time, you can count me among them." She smiled a sad smile and patted my hand. "I already do. In that case, what do you say to having lunch with a friend?" She smiled, her first real smile all day. "I'd love to." We both went to lunch in our cars. It began with a melancholy meal as we each silently recalled the sad events of the day. We knew this was going to happen, we had planned it together. Yet it was the end of 2 marriages and the life we had built and thought was ours. We talked about the 2 of them for a while and eventually decided it was time to move on. We talked about our kids and everything that was going on in our town. We even discovered that we had a few friends in common, and I knew they would be supportive of both of us. You know that when this is all over, our friends are going to try to set us up on blind dates with all of their single friends. At that thought, I involuntarily flinched. She laughed softly and said, "It won't be that bad. Who knows, you might even like it." All I could do was shake my head and sigh. As we talked, I became more and more optimistic about our future. Eventually, I made it home, not caring where the cheaters went individually or together, or how they got there. Perhaps they left together to plan a mutual defense or find lawyers, or maybe they just went to their weekly rendezvous. More likely, she'd given him a ride since Marie had their car. Of course, it was never that simple. Coming home later, Ruth went over every possible apology she could think of. She even threw in a few rebukes because we all know when a woman cheats, it must be at least in part her husband's fault. I wondered if the charlatan was still counseling her when she finally ran out of breath and sat sobbing. I decided it was my turn. I spoke briefly and matter-of-factly. "Ruth, you threw out our marriage. I felt sorry for you. The home you grew up in was hell on earth. I knew you were wounded by that life, but I thought you remained mostly unharmed. I thought that if I provided you with a truly loving marriage, you could heal and become the woman I knew you wanted to be. What I didn't realize is that you are incapable of healing. You are deeply broken. For every progress we've made, for every fortunate circumstance, you've ruined everything. You are incapable of being happy. All you know is sadness and destruction. I can't live like this anymore, and I don't want to live with a liar and a cheat. It's over between us, Ruth. The children are grown, and it's time for us to go our separate ways." I thought for a moment before I finished what I was going to say. You need help, Ruth. You need real therapy, not this charlatan who tries to validate everything you say and justify everything you do. And when you find a therapist like that, you need to let them control the sessions. I know you, and you need to be in control. You're not going to get where you need to go if you control the journey. You need a real professional to guide you through the process of introspection so you can get rid of the ghosts and demons that have haunted you since your youth. Please promise me that you will get real help. I doubted she heard my words. There were too many obstacles in her brain preventing her from accepting the admonition. And the sad truth is that she was too much of a coward to face her demons. I confessed that the decision to divorce Ruth came hard to me. I kept going back to my vows and remembering, in sickness and in health. There was no doubt in my mind that Ruth was not well. In the end, I decided that sick or not, Ruth could tell right from wrong, and betrayal was still betrayal. 3 years have passed since that fateful meeting with the therapist, and I have moved on with my life. The divorce was finalized a little over 2 years ago. We split our lives in half, and I was ordered to pay alimony for 3 years, less than a year to go. What I have learned from all of this is that when love dies and anger subsides, what remains is a deep sense of sadness and loss. I lost what I had, but I lost it long before the divorce, and I lost what I could have had if I had ever had it to begin with. However, you can't go through life focusing on what you've lost. I moved across town, kept the friends who over time became the best therapy for me, and rebuilt my life with a renewed focus on what I had always enjoyed and had given up too often because my wife wanted different things. In the process, I met a wonderful woman who shares my interests. We've both been burned before and are in no hurry. I'm optimistic, but I'm in no hurry. As for Bill, he got a pass. I wasn't about to go to jail just for a little revenge. Moreover, Marie needed him to make a living so he could pay for her upkeep. I guess he got what he deserved. The whole sad experience taught me an important lesson. I realized that we can build a good or even better life if we remember who we are, look forward, and take advantage of what life offers us. As for my ex, I doubt she will ever be happy. It's just not in her character to take the joy that life offers and live it. She will always be looking for something more than what she has, losing what is most important, all the while refusing to put a piece of herself into the lives of those around her. I feel sad for her, but I know now that I can't change who or what she is, and all I can do is move forward. Your narrative of divorce and subsequent recovery is filled with deep emotions and important lessons. You've faced difficulties with strength of character and wisdom, remaining optimistic and moving forward. It's important to acknowledge your feelings, strive for a healthy life, and find meaning even in the most challenging moments. Your experience serves as an example for those facing similar trials.